Hi there, this is Gareth, and it's a joy to be with you again. Having said that, there's a little bit of sadness that I can't personally be with you at this time, but hopefully sometime in the future I can come to the church itself and meet you all. Now this is the fourth part of a four-part series as part of your missions conference, where I've had the privilege of being the speaker. We've looked over the previous three parts at how God in Trinity is involved in mission. Today, we're going to look really more at the role of the church, at the part that we play in seeing the work of mission go forward. Now, Paul's response, we read in Romans chapter 15, verse 20, where he says, "It's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation." But for Paul to be able to successfully do the work of mission that God had called him to as an apostolic pioneer church planter, there needed to be the backing of the church, of other Christians, of fellow believers. And in Romans chapter 10, verse 13 to 15, he gives us the key as to the part that we play, to the responsibility that we have. Let me read Romans 10, verses 13 to 15. "For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent?" How shall they preach unless they are sent? I want us to look today very much at the role of those of us involved in sending, that is, the local church. You see, so often it's been very much the thought that there are those of us who go, and then there are those who stay. So we have those who go, those who stay. Or if you like, those who go and those who say goodbye. But that's not right. There are those who go and there are those who send. That really is the only choice. The whole church is involved in taking the whole gospel to the whole world. So if you're not going, then you are sending. Those really are the only two categories. And what I want us to look at today is the role of those who send, those who support. So I'm going to be talking about support. Now, as soon as we hear the word support, we think money and finance. It's much bigger than just the role of money and finance. We will come to that, but we're going to look at different areas that we're called to be involved in supporting. And the first area we're going to think about is what I call moral support. Again, a verse for you. These are the words of Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew chapter 26, verse 40. "Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, 'What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour?'" He wanted their fellowship. He wanted their encouragement. But sadly, it was not to be found. And really, the foundation of the support of those who go is that of moral support, of encouragement. And in that, we are all involved. We each have a significant part to play. When I first knew that God was calling me to take the message of the gospel beyond my culture, beyond my country, I remember going to see my pastor. And it was one of the most depressing experiences of my life, because his response was, "Well, aren't there needs here?" Here meaning where we live. And of course, there are needs here. But how can you compare needs here where there is a chance to hear the gospel? In my own town, there must be at least 12 churches preaching the gospel. How can you compare that with North India, where you can travel for a long time? Not only will you probably not find a church, you may not even find a single Christian. And so it was a very discouraging experience and conversation. And I remember I had a choice. The choice was actually to leave that church and join another church, because I'm fairly well known in the area and I'm sure another church would support me. That was the easy way out, but was that the right way out? And I thought, no, I'm going to stay and I'm going to pray for a change. And so for 6 months, I carried on doing what I've been doing, which was a school teacher. And I came back again to see the pastor. And I got an almost identical response, except for one sentence. Right at the end of our conversation, he said, but I am warming to what you're saying. I thought, wow, the ice is melting. There's a sign of warmth and empathy. And then 6 months later, I went back again. And in the in-between time, I was really praying for a change. And when I got back on this third visit, the pastor was there, but also some of the elders were gathered around. And they listened to me and they said, yes, we've decided that the call of God is in your life and we are happy to send you. And I remember they mentioned an amount of money to support me. That hadn't been the main motive. The main motive was getting the church behind what I was doing. But they mentioned an amount of money that was a large amount of money, far larger than I could ever have expected. And that church then continued to support me and then later my wife Malu and myself for many, many years. You see, for some people, the idea of going out and taking the gospel beyond the local church doesn't really fit with their thinking. They don't quite understand it. So you don't get the support that you want. And they have all sorts of questions about what you're doing and how you're going to do it. One thing that I found very helpful is if you're not sure whether or not God is calling you to go rather than to stay, try doing a few short-term mission trips. I would say that I am long-term as a result of doing many short-term trips. I began to see that this was somewhere where I could be involved in. I had a friend who did a short-term trip for 2 weeks and ended up staying with the organisation for 25 years. Mission should be thoroughly integrated into the life of the local church. It shouldn't be seen as something that is done by a few people who perhaps are a little bit fanatical, who've got a bee in their bonnet, as we say in English, who have this little hobby horse of always talking about the unreached. Not at all. Mission is central to the calling and the task of the church. And it should be there in Sunday school, it should be there in the worship, it should be there in the youth group, it should be in the elderly group who meet together. It's not just something that once a Sunday or once a conference is presented before the church. And I don't want to be like those who, when they get to the end of their life, regret that they didn't step out, that they didn't move by faith, that they didn't take the opportunity to share this gospel beyond their own culture. We recently had a survey done in the UK amongst elderly people, and these were not Christian people, these were just elderly people, asking them what one thing would they do differently if they could live their lives again. And all these answers were taken and processed, and they came up with one statement that most clearly communicated these people's feelings. And this was it. The majority of people, elderly people, looking back on their lives said this: we wish we'd risked more by making the most of the opportunities rather than being conformed to our comfortable situations. How sad to look back at lost opportunities, missed opportunities because of fear or because they wanted a comfortable life. So moral support is very important, that we support those who sense God's call to take this message and not to discourage them. I remember as a teacher, when I told the rest of the staff that I was going to serve God in missions, it wasn't a Christian school. The look on their faces was incredible. I could see some of them were some were surprised because I'd been so long at the school. Some were a little bit mocking, some were suspicious, and some had different questions. So if the world doesn't support, then of course we need the local church, our brothers and sisters, to support. So the first support is moral support. The second support I've called logistics support. And again, a verse for you, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13, which says this: Paul writing, "Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments." Paul needed practical help. There were nuts and bolts, as it were, added on to this ministry. And he needed the help of others to bring things, to move things for him. And it's very important that when we launch out as those who are called to take the gospel beyond our own culture, there are those who are going to help us with the very practical things. Things like, for instance, looking after our possessions if we have any, a car if we happen to have one, or even a home. We need those who will be behind us in the practical areas. And there are many Christians who are particularly gifted when it comes to helps. For many years I've had a friend called John, and John has probably been my number one helper for, 40 years. He's the one who comes to our little apartment where we live and checks up once a week that everything is okay. He's the one who will open the mail. He's the one who will pay the credit card bills. He's the one who will take us to the airports if we need that sort of transportation. Just keep an eye on the garden. Check that when we come back, that the fridge has got bread and milk in it. These sort of logistical supports are so important. You need to have, or it's helpful to have, maybe a map of the world somewhere in the church and a photograph of the missionary. If the missionary is moving around, maybe you can move the photograph to indicate the different countries that particular person is in. You need somebody to check regularly that the church is aware of the email address, the telephone number, all this sort of thing. You need people to help you to be logistically supported. I mean, if you get a message on the answer phone or some emergency arises, you need a point person who can communicate that with you, especially if it's a family concern. So logistic support is very important, and people need to be part of that network that's based in the church. Thirdly, financial support, the one that we all know very well. Philippians 4:19, Paul writing to the Philippian church, you'll all know this verse, "And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus." This is a vital area of support. It's not the only area of support, but it's a crucial area. In fact, from developing countries, often you find the main problem, the bottleneck in not seeing more Christians move out, is in the area of finance. One area that, in a sense, has been overcome in the Philippines, which I mentioned before, is that we have this big network of overseas foreign workers who go and do a secular job, so-called, in another nation, but also use that as very much an opportunity to share the gospel. So there needs to be an understanding that it costs to send somebody to the mission field from the local church. And that needs to be part of the overall budget of the church. Sometimes mission doesn't have a budget at all. The priority is the building, or maybe the salaries that need to be paid. And I'm not saying these are not important, but mission needs to have its own budget, its own account, its own facility, so that we can send people. It's so important, because that can be the one thing that stops more people going and serving God overseas. But then, of course, we need to consider what the needs are of the person going. I think it's important that you live a lifestyle which best enables you to do the work God has called you to do. I first went on a mission trip for a few months way back in the 1970s to West Africa. And I packed this suitcase full of things that I thought I would need. And when I got to West Africa, my suitcase never arrived. In fact, I think it arrived after about a month or two. It got mislabeled at London airport. So I arrived with nothing. So they took me out, got me some clothes. They got me a Bible and a toothbrush. And very quickly, surprisingly, I had everything I needed out there. I remember there was much prayer for my suitcase. When the suitcase finally arrived and I opened it up, I remember looking in it and thinking, well, do I really need all this stuff? You know, it's all superfluous to requirements, because I'd been given by those I was living amongst and working with everything that I needed. Sometimes we overload ourselves with baggage and take things out that are not particularly helpful. I remember we met one girl from a fairly close country, and I was talking to her about how she became a Christian. And she said to me, well, it was through one of the American missionaries that were living amongst us. I said, oh, you had a number of American missionaries? She said, oh, yeah. She said, but this one was different. I said, what do you mean different? She said, well, I don't want to be negative, but the place he lived in was of the same standard as the place that we lived in. He ate the food that we ate. The family spoke the language that we spoke. So when I went to his house, it wasn't a great deal different from my house. And I felt at home and I felt relaxed. And it was through that testimony that I came to know Jesus Christ as my Lord and Saviour. When we go and serve God, we want to incarnate the gospel. We don't want to set up a little kingdom of a higher class living than there is around us. Remember, in one country where we were working, there was a group who'd flown into that country. They'd bought an apartment, and they noticed all the things that were missing that they felt should be in that apartment, such as they would have back home. And they went and they bought all this high-flown stuff, expensive stuff. They completely kitted out the apartment. It was completely different from the apartment that everybody around was living in. And so while the locals were mildly fascinated, they weren't really about to listen to what these people had to say. Jesus came to his own. He lived amongst us as one of us. Of course, financial support is going to vary. It depends on where the person is going. It also depends on whether or not the person is going to earn a living using their profession or their training on the mission field. We talked about this in another session, but clearly there, finance is not necessarily going to be a main priority. Maybe helping them with getting their air ticket, but in other ways, no. And sometimes I've come across those who've criticised people who've gone out to serve as missionaries but have had a secular job while they're on the mission field. And I'm very much reminded of William Carey, a great pioneer missionary, who received a huge amount of criticism because when he went to India, he very quickly became the foreman at a factory that made indigo. Indigo is an expensive dye. And one person wrote to him and said, "You've sold your vision as a missionary to take up the vision of being a money-making merchant." Very clever to say that, but completely misunderstanding the fact that as the foreman in a factory, first of all, he quickly was able to learn the language. Secondly, because this factory took indigo from different places, he was able to visit some 200 villages where he could also share the gospel. And thirdly, not realizing that he had legal status as an employee within the country and therefore was respected for that. So to go and get employment in another country can be a very good way of touching the culture, meeting with the society and making a difference. And as I said before, there are many countries where you can't go into the country as a missionary. You have to have some sort of profession, and there are many that you can do. I mean, it's limitless. So financial support is important, and you need to talk with the one that you're sending out as to what their needs are and help him or her or them. If it's a family, of course, there'll be greater needs, to make sure that finance is not going to prevent them from answering God's call to take the gospel. Therefore, the church needs to structure itself in such a way that financial support is part of the budget. Fourthly, we have the importance of prayer support. Let me read Ephesians 3, verses 16 to 19. Paul writing again, that God would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. That's Paul's prayer request for the Ephesian church. Do you notice something about that prayer request? Did you read anything about programs? No. Did you read anything about financial provision? No. What was Paul praying for? In fact, what was Paul praying for? Not just here, but in most other parts of the epistles that he wrote. He's praying for their personal, spiritual development. We can learn a lot from the prayers of Paul, praying for their faith to increase, for their love to grow deeper, for their peace to be experienced, that they'll understand better the things of God, that they'll mature in their walk with God and in their faith. All this prayer is concentrated on the person, him or herself, developing deeper, stronger, more spiritual understanding in their hearts and lives. And I find that we rarely pray that for others. I don't know about you. It's easy to pray for programs and for provision, but for personal spiritual development. And yet this was key in the way that Paul prayed. You know, every church that we go to, almost, that Malou and I go to, someone will at some stage ask us, what are your prayer requests? What I used to say was this. I used to say, okay, can you pray please for our health? That's important. Especially as we travel. Can you pray for safety as we travel? Not just in airplanes, but in some of these vehicles, in some of these countries. Oh, can you pray for the anointing of the Holy Spirit as we minister? And I would add a number of other things. Nowadays, I only ever have one prayer request. I'm not saying they're not important, But there's a bigger prayer request, which is like an umbrella that covers everything. My prayer is, would you pray that our walk with God will be strong and good and holy? If our walk with God is right, then as husband and wife, our love for each other will be stronger and our ministry will be more glorifying to God. All those other things will come under that. If you get your walk right, then your work will be right. So important. Of course, there are other things to pray for, and the list is quite a sizable list. I can't go through all of it now, but you can imagine the sort of things for praying for families, for the children, for their education, for children to have friends, for single people who struggle perhaps sometimes with loneliness, for health problems, which I've already mentioned. Sometimes wives are unfulfilled on the mission field. It's very interesting. I've met plenty of missionaries' wives. I haven't met so many missionary wives. Do you hear the difference? Missionaries' wives, the wife married to the missionary, is not the same as a missionary wife who has her clear calling and work to do for God. And we want to make sure that the wife senses God's embrace, God's call, God's love in her life, that she has a part to play. She's not just an appendage. She's not just the wife of a missionary. She's a missionary wife in her own right. So prayer support is needed. And sometimes maybe fasting will be called upon for the church if there's a dangerous or difficult situation. I thank God that there used to be a group who prayed regularly for me. And now as a couple, we have many people praying for us. I never fail to be blessed and surprised when I go to a church and somebody I hardly know will come up and say, oh, by the way, I pray for you every day or regularly or every week. I mean, what more could I ask from somebody than that? It's such a blessing. But for that to happen, we need to make sure that we let them know what we are doing. And that takes me on to my next area of support, and that is communication support. Paul writing to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 16. Now, when this epistle is read among you, or this letter is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the letter or the epistle from Laodicea. Communication. Communication from the church to the one who's been sent, and communication from the one who's been sent to the local church. And both those areas need to be addressed. First of all, from the one who has been sent, it's important that we who are serving overseas keep regular communication going with the church or the fellowship back home. I thank God that over the years, regularly every month, we have sent out an update. I don't know how many updates that is, but really since the late 70s, almost without fail, we've sent an update out. And now our address database for our updates is over 2,700 people. And then on Facebook, I have over 3,300 friends. I don't know how many my wife Malou has. And there are also people with whom we can communicate. With today's opening of communication, it's far easier and there is less excuse for not being able to keep in touch with people. Both those who go, keep in touch with back home, and then those who are sending them. So what about those who are sending? What can they do? Well, there's a lot they can do. Now, because of email and WhatsApp, I know it doesn't work in every country, but in many countries it is so easy. Not just to keep in touch verbally by speech, but actually to see the person as well. So there really is no excuse for sending the person, saying goodbye, and then you really don't see them again or hear from them again for the next year or two. So it is vital that we keep open the channels of communication. You can send gifts sometimes, care packages. I used to enjoy receiving copies of the local paper. I used to enjoy receiving letters. We don't send letters so much now, I know, but I remember some letters I got I really enjoyed. Others, to be honest, they didn't do much for me. And I've got to be honest, the letters that were sent to me that were basically somebody preaching a sermon in the letter, it wasn't a great help. If you're spending all your life preaching sermons yourself or preparing messages, you don't really want to receive a sermon in a letter. You want to receive news from home. You want to receive some of the gossip in the best sense of the word, you know, who's had a baby, who's died, who's got a new job, what's happening in this family, what's happening in that family. You want to know, you want to keep in touch so that when the notices are read out every Sunday, you're also hearing what was in those notices. It is so important. And it's equally important that we who are sent communicate with the church back home. I find it very sad. Sometimes on our ship, I meet somebody and they've not heard anything from their church. They're faithfully sending communication, but rarely do they hear anything. And then they get quite sad when they hear of others who are having communication, and also others who are having visitors. Probably the best communication, I know it's not always possible financially or whatever, but if you can actually make a personal visit to the person you've sent, wow, it just makes their day. It's just such a blessing if someone can come from the local church just for a short time to visit and encourage them. Prayer support is crucial. Not just prayer before they go, not just prayer at the point of going, but ongoing prayer so that they feature in the prayer meeting. And again, someone could take the responsibility of collating the information and then giving out that information to those in the prayer meeting so they can pray. And remember the prayer for the development of the person, for their growth in grace and faith and love and peace. Because as they grow closer to Jesus, so of course they'll be more at home and more effective. And prayer is also something important before you go to serve God. The fact that 3 times I went and saw my pastor before finally he gave me the green light, what it did for me was it increased my prayer life. I prayed more and more. So I remember when I stepped onto the ship, the doulos originally, I felt like it was a hand going into a glove. After all this prayer, I knew this was the place I could be and felt very much at home. And then lastly on my list, it's what I've called reentry support. Now what I mean by that is, reentry is when the missionary, the Christian worker, comes back home after being away for 1 or 2 years. For some, that is harder than actually leaving home and going to the mission field. And it can be especially hard for children and teens who are third culture kids. They don't quite know where they belong. They look different, maybe they sound different. I remember a friend of mine struggling with this. He's actually now a church leader, but years ago he was really struggling. His mother was Austrian, his father was Dutch, he was born in India, he lived on a ship. You know, what nationality am I? Do I just look at my passport? I know a friend of mine has got an Australian passport. He's an older guy. He spent hardly any time in Australia his whole life. He has an Australian passport because that's where he was born. But his whole life has been lived outside of Australia. And so you come back home and what do you find? Tell you what I found. First of all, I found there was a new coinage, a new coin in our currency. And I went to the shops and I didn't know what it was. I mean, the shopkeeper must have thought I was crazy. I didn't recognise the coinage. And then, of course, PIN numbers that you haven't used. I've forgotten the PIN numbers. And you go back to church and there are some people who've died, who were there when you left, but they're not there now. And everybody, of course, has aged. Their lives have moved on. But in a sense, yes, yours has moved on, but then it hasn't moved on. I remember, for instance, one time I used a word that I'd used before, and it had become actually a swear word in the language. I never even knew. They said, "Gareth, do you know what you're saying?" I said, "No." They told me this word now had got a very bad meaning. It hadn't had that meaning when I left. I went down to the local town. The car park wasn't there anymore. I couldn't find anywhere to park the car. Things have changed. You've changed. You come back to your church, and although the church has changed in some ways, in other ways it hasn't. It's still going through the same things. And some people say, "Oh, we didn't know you were coming back," or "Oh, nice to see you back." And you've been away. And you want, at the right time, the chance to share in the church. You want closure to this period of time that has so deeply impacted you, and you don't get the chance to share. So difficult. And then you get frustrated with people. A friend of mine who'd been serving in India wonderfully came back home, and there was a woman in the church. I think he went to her house for lunch, I can't remember. And all she wanted to talk about was the new vacuum cleaner that she bought, which was so much better than the old vacuum cleaner. He couldn't take it. It's all she wants to talk about is some latest little technological gadget when he'd been out there taking the gospel to the unreached people. He was frustrated, and it was very difficult for him to reintegrate. In fact, he went back to India and spent the rest of his life there and finally passed away in India. People's concerns seem so petty, so small, when you've been dealing with the task of taking the gospel to the unreached. And also, you come back sometimes really needing an ICU, an intensive care unit. I mean by that, you need emotional downtime. Physically, you're probably very tired. Spiritually, you might be drained and exhausted from ministry. Mentally, you just need to rest and reorientate. Socially, you're finding it hard to pick up with relationships, or maybe the relationships you had are no longer there because the people have left and you've got new people in the church. It can be very, very difficult and challenging. So we need to learn how to welcome back those who have been on the mission field and help them in their re-entry. Give them a chance to share. Let me share with you a few verses from the Acts of the Apostles. How closure to ministry times was dealt with. Acts chapter 4, verse 20 through 23. And being let go, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said to them. They went back and shared. Acts 14:27. Now when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that he'd opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. They needed to tell, not just for their own sense of completion, but also for the blessing of the church. The church needs to hear what you've done, needs to know what's been happening. Acts 15 verse 4. And when they had come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that God had done with them. It's a regular pattern through the Acts of the Apostles. Every so often, the church would be gathered. The person who'd come back from the ministry would be there, sharing what God had done, sharing the disappointments, sharing the joys, sharing the requests for prayer. Acts 21 verse 19. When he had greeted them, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. There is nothing more disappointing than coming back home and just getting a casual, "Hi, didn't even know you'd been away." What? That's so sad when we haven't got an opportunity to share. Having said that, Don't make the mistake of thinking, whoa, the missionary's home. And one of my friends arrived, and at the airport, I think it was his mother said, oh, I've got 3 meetings lined up for you. He thought, that's the last thing I want. I don't want any more meetings, not at the moment. I just need to rest. I need to sleep. Yesterday, Malou and I were on the phone to 3 people from Papua New Guinea who've just come off the ship and are trying to get back to Papua New Guinea. They were hoping to fly from the Philippines, but that wasn't possible.